starting to realize that people in leadership position are actually people like us, right? And that in many ways they are not superhuman. That kind of decreased a lot my own self-doubt. And so interacting with people in position of leadership, that's probably what led me to be more confident in taking some position of leadership myself.
Have you ever noticed that some of the best ideas come from unexpected places? Your next breakthrough may come from a leader facing similar challenges, but in a completely different sector. Welcome to Chief Influencer. I'm your host, Anthony Shop. Join us as we explore how today's successful leaders inspire, influence, and connect with others. Chief Influencer is a production of Social Driver and the Communications Board, who have teamed up to spotlight how great leaders and communicators are making their impact in the world. This episode is brought to you by the George Washington University's College of Professional Studies. With in-person and online programs, ranging from master's degrees in public relations strategy to certificate programs in digital communications, GW offers more than just the credentials to help working professionals get ahead. It prepares them to be leaders in their field. As a proud GW graduate myself, I can attest that faculty members combine academic rigor with real-world lessons that can't always be found in textbooks. Check out cps.gwu.edu for more information. I am thrilled to introduce today's guest, Fabrice Houdart. He's the Executive Director of the Association of LGBTQ+ Corporate Directors, a new organization that provides services, support, and networking on behalf of LGBTQ+ existing and aspiring board members. Before we dive in, here are 3 things I think you should know about Fabrice. Number 1, he spent the bulk of his career at intergovernmental organizations, first at the World Bank and later the United Nations. There he focused on Free and Equal, an unprecedented campaign for LGBTQ+ equality, and co-authored and led the United Nations Global LGBTQ+ Standards of Conduct for Business, the largest corporate social responsibility initiative on LGBTQ+ issues in the world. Number 2, this expertise led him to found the Association of LGBTQ+ Corporate Directors, and later COPA, the LGBTI+ Economic Empowerment Lab. And number 3, Fabrice serves on a number of boards, including the L'Oreal Global Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Board, the Women's Forum Editorial Board, and more. He's been named to about every list I could find of top LGBTQ+ leaders out there, including Yahoo, Finance, Crain's, Attitude Magazine, and more. Fabrice, you have been called many things, from one of the 100 most influential governance experts by the National Association of Corporate Directors, an outstanding LGBTQ+ leader, and even a top voice by LinkedIn. Today, we are thrilled to call you a chief influencer. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Anthony. I really appreciate it.
Well, I have to say, I've been a subscriber to your Substack for a long time, which we'll talk about later. And, I'm grateful that you put so much time and energy in sharing updates with the world. And we'll get to that. But just to start, how did you go from working for the UN to helping LGBT business leaders join corporate boards?
Well, thank you so much for asking. What is difficult is that sometimes you end up creating a narrative about your own career and you don't really remember if it's true or if it was just chaotic, and you try to justify it later on. I think there is a tiny bit of coherence in the fact that I always work on economic development. I was at the World Bank for 16 years, which frankly was the longest job I ever had. And now, I work on COPA, and it's very focused on the economic empowerment of LGBT people in the global south. And that kind of remained a constant in my life. This idea that some people are not benefiting equally from development, and, how can you ensure that they do? The Association of LGBT Corporate Directors came a little bit from left field. To be honest with you, I don't know much about the private sector because I am a civil servant, right? I was at the World Bank for 16 years and I was at the UN for 4 years. Even though at the UN I worked a lot on the private sector. But I happened to be an expert witness on AB 979, which was a legislation in California that mandated some level of board diversity. And in the process of looking at board diversity in America, I realized that all the other minorities had organized themselves, right? Instead of waiting for the dominant group to hand them board seats, what they've done is that they had said, well, look, we are going to make sure we help each other. We are going to make sure we prepare people in our population to serve on corporate board, right? And the boardroom is a little bit of an opaque part of business, in many ways. And so it makes sense for underrepresented group to organize themselves. So, when I got a green card when I went in 2020, for 2023, last year. And when I did, my thinking was like, oh, I should create that nonprofit at some point in my life. And then I was like, well, there might not be another point in my life where I have time to do it. So I created it. So that's the story, but I have found it fascinating. So I'm kind of sticking with that topic, even though that's not really something that was on my radar screen 6 years ago.
Yeah, it's kind of a fun pivot. Obviously, still consistent with what you did before, but in a new sphere. When you talk about representation, I'm reminded of the interview that we did with Anise Parker, who's the former mayor of Houston, and she leads the LGBTQ Victory Fund and Victory Institute. And she often says, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And so that's, they focus so much on representation in the political sphere, elected officials, and I think also appointed officials. I wonder if you could just talk about the type of influence that you had to use to get that message out about the importance of LGBTQ plus representation in the corporate boardroom, because obviously, the members of the community who want to be on boards, I mean, you have to reach them and try to get them together and raise their hand to be part of it. But then you're also influencing corporations to try to get them to understand, why this is important. And you got to get a lot of people to agree with you to start a nonprofit that folks want to, contribute to and be part of. So can you talk a little bit about that story? Because you weren't coming in with a formal logo the way that you were when you were doing work for the World Bank or the UN. You had to create a brand and get influence that wasn't conveyed through an intergovernmental organization.
Yeah, that's funny. I mean, it was a bit painful, in many ways, because I have never created anything. And, I love to say I'm actually a French, boring bourgeois. I hate the idea of taking risk, and trying new things sometimes can be a bit painful. And, one of the things that struck me the most is that I had to create a board. That's very important, right? If you create a nonprofit, you have to have a board. And frankly, because of the fact that I'm slightly unknown in that space, my board had to be constituted of people that were board members. And one of the things that I did at the beginning is that I reached out to my friends, and my friends were the last one to say yes.
Hmm.
The people that said yes were people that I didn't know, and I had to convince them that it was worthwhile. I think there was a need for it, and that helped a lot. Right, the fact that the I had that intuition that we needed to organize ourselves, but it happened to be the case. Right, we needed to do it, so it was easier to convince people because there was indeed um, a need for it. I think sometimes what is a little difficult is that the boardroom is not really on the radar screen of LGBT people. You're right. Like in many ways, they know that it's important to be represented in the political sphere. And that's the reason why there is a Victoria Institute. And in fact, we have done huge progress. I think now we have about 11 elected people in Congress, right? LGBT people in Congress, which is a little below 3%. It might actually be closer to 2%. I can't remember exactly. People understand that. I think LGBT people live under the illusion that they're doing very well in business. Successful LGBT people will typically vacation in Fire Island and in Provincetown, and they see each other. They live in New York, they live in San Francisco. They're like, oh, we did it as a community. We're doing well. We live in a post-gay era. Well, that's not the case. LGBT people, when it comes to power and when it comes to money, LGBT people live a little bit on the margin of the ecosystem. I happen to have hard data, so now we know LGBT people represent 0.9% of board seats on Fortune 500, and they represent 1.2% of board seats on Nasdaq. So what it means is that we are severely underrepresented, and so we have to do something about it. And that part sometimes it's a little bit difficult to convince LGBT people that are in business. You are going to have to go a bit of an extra mile if you want to reach your potential in the boardroom.
You mentioned the stats there that you're capturing for corporate boards, and also you mentioned the elected members in Congress. I just had to plug the Victory Fund has this really great website called outforamerica.org, and it shows every elected official that they're aware of at even the local level, and so you can see those percentages. And I think what's really striking is that on one hand you look at it and it's across the entire country. You go, wow, that's a big impact. People are often surprised, to see states in the middle of the country that have representation. But then when you look at the percentage on the right, you realize it's way lower than you would expect in terms of share of population. And it sounds like that's maybe a similar story that you're telling with corporate boards, less than 1% representation. But when you do list the board members that are at these different corporations, they're representing a lot of different industries. And I wonder if you could just kind of talk a little bit more about that. What's the importance of the work you do to bring these board members together so that they have an association? But then how do you work with them to try to get more representation on corporate boards? What does that look like?
What I think also is important is to think that it's not representation for the sake of representation, right? We're not just trying to get LGBT people in the boardroom because, of their individual success, right? It's based on this idea, and that's probably where I find coherence with what I did in the past, which is exactly what you mentioned, when you quote Anis Parker, right? The idea that if LGBT people are at the table, first, it might lead to better outcomes for our community. And then I think a second aspect is also the conviction that not only LGBT diversity, but also, racial diversity and ethnic diversity, socioeconomic diversity might lead to different outcomes. And I work at the World Bank and the UN, and what I saw all of my life is that the people that take decisions tend to be the same people, right? When I get to places of power, it tends to be the same type of people that are taking decisions. And a lot of people would argue that the outcomes we have as a society are not great, right? And the idea is that by bringing diversity, you might have completely different outcomes. One thing I love to do is quote the former head of the IMF. I can't remember her name now. She a French woman, and she said she was the head of the IMF at the time of the economic crisis in 2008, and she said if Lehman Brothers had been Lehman Sisters, we might have had completely different outcome. And I love it because it's true. In the end, you don't know what would happen if you had better representation in decision making.
Yeah.
We suspect you might have a better outcome. So the way we do it is that we bring people together, hoping first of all that they are going to help each other. We also try to bring allies in the room. Straight people maybe that have positions of power in the boardroom and might be interested in our candidates. And then the third aspect is that there is some level of education in which we not only kind of try to better a little bit the candidacy of LGBT people that are veering for boards, but we also connect them to the players in the ecosystem that are very important, like the National Association of Corporate Directors, the Private Director Association, the New York Stock Exchange, that has a board diversity initiative. And then a bunch of other players like, the investment banks, the consulting firms, that are all the pipeline for corporate talent into the boardroom. So what is nice is that there is a recipe to it that the Latinos have been applying, that the Asian American are applying, and we're basically replicating it. So it's not we are not really reinventing the wheel, which is nice.
Are you finding that those other groups that have already been taking these efforts and that you're sort of following a similar playbook, are they open to partnering with you, or is there a sense of competition that there's only so many seats available?
No, people are actually very supportive. What is interesting is that a lot of this cooperation between underrepresented group is unfortunately very much based on interpersonal relationships. So, as an example, I have very good relationship with the Asian American group, which is us and Pinnacle, and they have been very helpful. The head of the Latino Corporate Director Association happens to be gay, so he's on the board of our association. That has been very useful. And then, I'm very close to women's group. They actually just spoke to our board as we are trying to do some strategic planning for next year. So I find that there is really an understanding that it's not a zero-sum game. You know, there are so many boards, first of all, and second of all, the size of board is kind of increasing, to some extent. So there is not really a sense that, oh, look, if you're picking an LGBT person, then it means that some person of color is not going to get a board seat.
Got
Then
it.
I have one asset, which is that LGBT people are incredibly intersectional, right? So actually, you can get an LGBT person of color, right? Or you can get an LGBT woman of color, right? And so, in many ways, the association is very focused on getting more women in the boardroom, more lesbians in the boardroom, more trans women in the boardroom, which, by the way, is abysmal. So, I never really found a situation in which people are like, okay, well, now LGBT people want board seats to,
Yeah.
that's going to take away from our objectives.
So far, we've been talking a lot about how you had to use influence to create this organization, how your organization is trying to, influence corporate America, the way that they see representation on boards. I want to ask you what you've sort of learned working with board members, because you are in sort of a unique spot. I mean, you've worked with a number of world leaders in your previous roles, and then now you have your own board, which is comprised, most of them are corporate directors themselves, but then you are interacting with other corporate directors. So these are folks who are, really successful, have a lot of business and other experience, and they have to influence others to achieve outcomes, whether that's employees or whether that's fellow board members. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about what you've learned, what you've observed working with so many high powered board members about influence. Could you speak to some examples of maybe what you've seen and what you've taken away from that experience?
Yeah, I think it's a bit intimidating, right? So, as an example, my board is made of people that serve on boards, on corporate boards, right? So they are used to be extremely demanding when it comes to governance, right? And my board is extremely well organized in committees. They are very serious about meeting as committees, and in a way, it has made it also easier. Um, I'll tell you, I am a bit intimidated by people that are succeeding in business, and it comes probably from the fact that I've always been terrible at making money. I'm very good at spending money. I'm terrible at making it, and we live in a society where making money is extremely valued. What I have noticed, and it's completely based on observation, right, is that they tend to get rid of all the information they don't need, right? And that means that they will not pay attention to a lot of details, right? They will tend to focus on the big picture and kind of get rid of all the information that is a distraction. And I think for me it's been interesting because I tend to absorb a huge amount of information. And it's true that it kind of clouds a little bit your judgment. It can also be a distraction. And I think that as I age a little bit, I'm starting to think, well, look, how can you pare down the amount of information you process? Because it's true that I think if you're a leader in business, you have to focus on the big picture. And so the goal is to get rid of all the information that is not relevant to your decision making. And that has struck me a lot. It's true that one of the blessing of this adventure, right, is that I have encountered a lot of fascinating people. The people that speak at our summit, the people that speak at the dinner, we do a lot of dinners, right? They tend to be extremely interesting, And that's a big perk of having created this organization, is that I meet fascinating people.
It sounds like what you shared about the demands of the governance, from corporate board, probably ups the standard for a nonprofit board of what you have to do, which is probably a great thing for your organization. Could you talk a little bit about, again, I'm not an expert in corporate boards, and you certainly know a lot about them now through this experience. I would think that for a board member, no board member has much power on their own. All the power is in the body of board members, and so they have to influence one another. And I wonder if you could just share anything about that, that maybe you've observed about the intentionality of having to connect with and influence fellow board members.
Yeah, it's interesting because what I tell LGBT people all the time, and it might be a bit controversial, is I say, well, look, when you get to the boardroom, you're going to meet the same bullies that bullied you in the playground, right? Meaning that the bullies usually have made it also to the top of business. And the question is always, how do you influence without giving up your own values, your own uh, outlook on life, right? And I think people tend to have very different way of leading. I spoke at the New York Stock Exchange a few weeks ago, right before the election, and there was one of the panelists that was saying, well, look, if Kamala Harris gets elected, then China will immediately invade Taiwan because they will find that the United States is weak. And I responded to the guy and I said, well, look, that sounds a little bit misogynistic, this assumption that if there is a woman that is leading, then the the opponents or will perceive the country as weak. And the guy responded to me and he said, look, I would have no problem if it was Margaret Thatcher. And the idea was, what he basically meant is that if this is a, a masculine type way of leading, then I am comfortable with it. But if it's a different leadership style, then I find that it's not going to be effective. And I think that's the biggest challenge for LGBTQ plus people, is to understand that they can tap into their own leadership style, that they don't have to emulate a leadership style that is about bullying or a leadership style that is about, manipulating, that there is a huge category of leadership style. And that's probably one of the biggest challenge in the boardroom, is to not adopt the usual way of leading, right? And instead try to lead by consensus, or try to lead by discrete influence. I find that fascinating. I think there is a lot of studies that show that underrepresented group even have difficulties exerting influence when they get in the boardroom. And I always say that's why I believe the association is not a short-term project. I think it's a long-term project, because even if we had a fair number of board seats, to be able to influence the boardroom, there is a lot of other things that come into play, including, as an example, leading committees or becoming the board chair, right? And we've seen that with women, in which women get in the boardroom, but they're never the board chair, right? And so I think those are very interesting questions, right? Which is, how do you influence? What is your influential your style of influencing? And the idea that it doesn't always have to be this masculine confrontational way of influencing.
Well, and I want to pose that same question back to you, because you said that it's important for folks to find their own style of influence that's authentic to them. It doesn't have to be just a one size fits all. So as you show up in boardrooms now, and you lead you lead this organization, so you work with your own board, but you sit on other boards as well. How would you describe your own style of influence?
Well, that's interesting. I think I have a bit of a peculiar journey, which is that I always lack confidence in my abilities, and a lot of it has to do with being gay, right? And also always evolving in very patriarchal organizations like the World Bank and the United Nations. I always love to say that now that I'm older, I look back at my career at the World Bank and I say I very quickly understood that people like me were not becoming senior vice president or managing director. Right? I could not really imagine a gay guy leading in an organization like the World Bank. And that completely affected my loyalty to the organization.
Hmm.
I never really thought, oh, okay, well, I'm always going to be there, which is very often the case of my colleagues, right? And when I was at the United Nations, I had a bit the same feeling. It was very rare to see a gay guy that was an assistant secretary, right? There is that thing called the lavender ceiling, right, in which you would never really make it to the top of the organization. Um, so it always come a little bit as a surprise to me that that I when I take leadership role. As an example, I'm the chair of an institute in Washington D.C. called the Institute of Current World Affairs. I'm the chair of the board, right? I've been on the board for a really long time, and then eventually they asked me to become the chair. And frankly, my reaction was like, why would they want me to be the chair?
Hmm.
And I think that one of the fascinating thing is that once you take leadership roles, you kind of become a little bit used to it. You
Hmm.
know what I mean? I became chair of that board, and now I'm on a bunch of non-profit board. Right, I'm on the board of Housing Works in New York or Outright, um, Action International. I'm on the board of the International Day Against Homophobia and Transphobia, and I never think of myself as someone that could be chair of the board. But now that I'm chair of the board of the institute, I'm thinking, well, maybe at some point I could become chair of the board. So I know that's kind of a convoluted way to respond to your question, but what I think is that very often we limit our own ambitions
Yeah.
based on the fact that we always carry the burden of shame and we always carry the burden of self-doubt that comes with being gay, right? Particularly people of my generation. And it's a lifelong recovering journey. So I have an ambivalent reaction to leadership. I happen to now be the executive director of a nonprofit de facto. You know what I mean? Not because I ever said I would be, but because I created that nonprofit, and frankly, it made sense for me to lead it. So I am a little bit of an in leadership position by accident, but I'm kind of realizing also something I realized, when I was when I became a father, which is I tell people all the time. I say straight people made parenting appear much harder than it actually is. My experience with parenting is that you fall in love with your kids and everything becomes possible, right? But very often I felt that straight people were making it appear as if this is incredibly hard and I'm not sure gay people are qualified to be parents. And that's not how it works at all. And that was a bit of a surprise to me.
Hmm. When you were talking about that doubt, I just appreciate you sharing that vulnerability, because I think, for folks who are trying to exert their own influence wherever they may be in their career, hearing somebody who has achieved so much discuss that, because people might look and say, "Oh, well, you got here because you didn't have that doubt and you were so sure of yourself," but actually, you struggled with that as well, and it's something that you were able to overcome, perhaps use in some ways to fuel yourself forward and say, hey, I'm not going to move up the ranks in this organization. I'm going to create my own organization to fill a gap.
That's a pretty common gay experience. And I have this amazing situation in which I find myself at the end of the funnel, right? If you look at the boardroom, that's really the end of the career, right? That's like the highest echelon of corporate. And very few LGBT people make it.
Yeah.
because there's so many obstacles to their success. It's incredible, right? It's actually incredible. And a lot of LGBT people will leave companies exactly because of what I described with the World Bank. They cannot see themselves in a position of leadership because, first of all, there's nobody like them in leadership. And second of all, because the culture is not supportive. And
Mm,
so actually a lot of them become entrepreneurs, which is fascinating. And we find that a lot of people are in the boardroom, LGBT people are in the boardroom just because they have created their own companies, you know. Um, so I love to say that one thing I dislike about our community is that LGBT people tend to constantly minimize what happened to them. You know, they constantly say, "Oh, I was bullied in high school, but now I am this executive vice president in this company. I have a summer home in the Hamptons. Everything is fine." What I think is that if you grow up gay in an environment that is not supportive, right, that is not even representing LGBT people in the curriculum in class, of course, you spend the rest of your life playing catch up, and it's extremely unfair. But I think the first step to recover is to acknowledge that this is not insignificant, and that
mm,
this is going to, of course, affect the way you that's going to affect your personal life, but it's also going to affect your professional life.
mm. Well, it shows the importance of the community you're building for folks who understand one another and can support, one another in that way and recognizing, that shared journey. I want to ask you, you've done many things in your career, Fabrice, and I'm interested in sort of the breakthrough strategies or breakthrough tactics that have maybe you've taken with you across multiple roles to influence others. Because obviously you've been a successful influencer. That's why you're on Chief Influencer today, because throughout your whole career, and then now the work that you've done to create this organization and bring people together. What are some of the lessons you've learned, the qualities that you think have helped you to influence others across your career?
I'll tell you what I always remember is that when I was at the World Bank, I ended up being the head of the employee resource group. And that was transformative for me, right? Because that leadership role that I couldn't really find in my job, I could have it in the gay group, you know. And it was a little bit like leadership on training wheels, right? But it didn't really matter that much. Um, but I remember that at some point I had to go to see the executive director of the bank, and this is the highest echelon, right? At the board of the World Bank, and I had to go to see them because we were very unhappy with the gender strategy at that time. It didn't mention sexual orientation and gender identity, and we felt, in 20, I can't remember when it was, but 2014 probably, you cannot really publish the gender strategy and not take in consideration that many of the women you're dealing with actually have some sex attraction, or that's a reality in the world. So the team was very resistant. I went to see the executive director, and I will always remember that day. One of my best friends had given birth the night before, and for some strange reason, I had slept at the hospital. And in the morning, I went to the World Bank, and I had to meet the Swedish executive director. And I started sweating as I got into our office. And the more I sweat, the more I became self-conscious, and the more I sweat. And at the end, there literally was a puddle of like water on the floor. And she was extremely gracious. She was a former minister, I think. She didn't mention it at all. We had the conversation, and I left. But I felt that starting to realize that people in leadership position are actually people like us, right? And that in many ways they are not they are not superhumans. That kind of decreased a lot my own self-doubts. And so interacting with people in position of leadership, that's probably what led me to be more confident in taking some position of leadership myself.
Mm. Another thing about you is that I know consistency is a really important part of your brand and something that you've really focused on across your career. One way any of us can see that is through your successful Substack. I think it's so interesting right now. Leaders are finding very different ways to reach their audiences, whether that's traditional media or LinkedIn, and now Substack is becoming so popular. Every week, reliably, we get an update from you. It must take a lot of time to put together because it's very thorough, and you share wonderful news updates and headlines and et cetera. Can you maybe talk about, I mean, I'd like to hear a little bit about the consistency thing, because there are probably some other parts of your career that's come through as well. But I'd also like you to share a little bit about your journey, about why you created a Substack, how that's been working for you as you've grown that audience. Because as leaders are trying to determine what tools to use to get their message out, influence others, this is one they're looking at. And I think you have a really great case study to share.
Yeah, that's interesting. The Substack is a very self-indulgent exercise, right? In which I share my opinion about what is going on global LGBT issues and on issues in the US. I started it probably because when I was at the World Bank and the UN, I could never say anything. You know, you know, every comment to the New York Times had to be clear by layers of hierarchy, and I always felt very muzzled. And so I could when I could create a Substack, I really enjoyed it because I could say whatever I felt. There's about 20,000 readers, so I have to be a little bit cautious about not saying anything that would upset people too much. But I have a lot of freedom with it. A lot of my friends make fun of me because I'm adamant about sending it at noon every Wednesday, and my friends are like, nobody cares. You could send it on Thursday at 2 p.m. Nobody would notice. Um, I feel it's really important to me because I have had that experience that when you start something but you don't really commit to it, it's easy for it to wither away and
Mhm.
for you not to persist. And in a way, it hasn't been an incredibly successful exercise, right? I have 20,000 subscribers, but only a tiny little group, pays. And sometimes it can be a dry exercise. Sometimes I get a lot of response, but sometimes nobody says anything, and I don't really know how the world is receiving it. And so I stick to it. I mean, I have to say that one of the reasons I stick to it is that I really enjoy it, right? And there's never a moment where I'm like, oh, it's very rare that I'm like, oh, I have to write this. This is annoying. Sometimes it's Tuesday night and I haven't written a line, and I'll start writing, and I really enjoy it. I mean, there are many things in my life where I am slightly ambivalent about. I have a bunch of different activities, and there are many activities where I'm like, do I really need to do this? Does this bring me joy? The Substack was always very easy because I love writing. I love LGBT issues, and I also love providing a service, right? Feeling that there is some relevance to what I do. And it's sometimes harder with other initiatives, right? Because uh, if you are in the business of social change, which I guess I'm in the business of,
Mhm.
you don't really see the results. You don't really see. Of course, it would be great if we have more people paying attention to the socioeconomic outcome of LGBT people. Of course, it's great if there are more LGBT people in the boardroom. But my allegiance is to the LGBT community. The vast majority of LGBT people have short British lives, and and I suspect that I'm not going to see radical changes in my lifetime. So it's a lot of investing in a future that I probably won't see. And so what I love with the Substack is that it's something concrete I can do.
Yeah.
Sometimes I get feedback about it, and it feels good.
You're also a LinkedIn top voice, and I wondered if you could share how important that platform is or isn't for you to influence the corporate world, because you're obviously, trying to stay connected with your board members and other people in the corporate realm.
That's funny you say that because what defines me a lot is self doubt, right? And I think that's a lot of the part of the journey of being a gay man. It's always like you don't really have a script for your life, So you have to create it as you go along, and all the time you're like, am I doing what I'm supposed to do with my life, right? That's a question that my brother never had to ask himself. My brother follows the scripts of my parents, and that makes for a very comfortable life, I think. So anyway, I say that because I read that Elon Musk said that it makes him cringe when people post on LinkedIn, which, by the way, is a bit of a self-serving comment when you have a
Right.
competing social media thing. But it really got to me. I was like, is it cringe-worthy how much I post on LinkedIn? Uh, I do post a lot on LinkedIn. um, I kind of like it. Those are people I want to influence. LGBT people in places of power that might not really be thinking about their duty to the community. And I love the fact that I have a place where I can be like, look, those are important things you can influence. You should pay attention to it. Um, so I invested in LinkedIn a little bit. I cannot say that organically. I think I have 20,000 contacts, right? Or people. I don't really know how it works, but people that follow the page, and the truth is that it didn't happen by accident. I post pretty regularly. I I kind of scroll it during the day, and so I think I'm going to continue to do it despite Elon Musk's saying that it's a bit cringe.
Yeah, we've been hearing it from so many corporate leaders, nonprofit leaders, our chief influencers that LinkedIn is a powerful platform. And what I found really interesting for some of them, it's about engaging external partners, meeting new folks. But then in some cases, one of our CEOs, Steve Taylor from the Arthritis Foundation, talked about the power of LinkedIn to engage with his own employees, as sort of a new digital water cooler where he can see what people are saying and he can like it and comment on it, and how it's been really valuable for him to keep a finger on the pulse of what's going on and show people that he cares. So I think it's a trend, it's something, and I think, yeah, to your point, Elon Musk's comments are sort of self-serving because he runs another platform. So
Yeah, and I think also the question with social media is always you have to question a little bit your motives. What are you trying to achieve?
mhm,
Is this is this really a tool that contributes to your objectives of having an impact, right? Or are you just celebrating yourself? It's a real risk. I used to be huge on Friendster when I was young.
I remember Friendster, yeah.
I had a huge Friendster account, and it never really achieved anything. And in many ways, the people I kept in touch, those were not real interaction, right?
Yeah.
And the Friendster account does not exist anymore. And so you always have to be a little bit careful about what
Yeah.
are your motives. But I think that's true about your entire life, right? What are your motive? What are your motive? What are you trying to achieve? You know, um, those are questions we should ask ourselves all the time.
Fabrice, to close out, I just want to ask you, as you try to influence people, whether it's through your Substack, your LinkedIn, your board members in person, I just wonder, are there any places that you have gotten inspiration in your career that have influenced you about how you show up to make change and influence others, social change, like you said before?
Yeah, first of all, there are a few people that I do ask advice to, and my judgment has not always been very good. And there are, I have had a pretty intense career. When I was at the World Bank, I had famously a huge falling out with the president over a governance issue. Um, you know, I have found myself sometimes in the middle of controversies, right, on LGBT issues, and as much as I trust my judgment, I don't trust it 100%. And so, if it's important, I will pick up the phone and I will say, what do you think? And I today, as an example, I have to react to a piece of news that is affecting the Association of LGBT corporate directors. And in the past, I would have written the press release myself. And but now I have a board, which is great. I'm asking the board well, what do you think? This is what I have prepared. And in fact, the response was to say, well, we don't really like the first paragraph. We like the second paragraph, and basically sending me back to the drawing board. Um, I think the more I age, the more I believe that um, it's much better when there is a bunch of people that are involved in decision making, which, by the way, is pretty much the premise of the Association of LGBT Corporate Directors, right? The idea is that if you bring a bunch of people, you get a better outcome than if it's always the same people taking decision. And I apply that to my life too, which is I ask more and more advice to people, whether it's about the way I raise my children, or or about the way I run. I have two nonprofits now, and I'm relying more and more on other people on other people's opinion, and advice. And I think that's important, is to find people that you can pick up the phone and say, well, look, this is what I'm thinking of doing, but do you think this is the right way to approach it?
Hmm. Well, that's a great thread to close on, the power of community when we're trying to influence. And you've certainly been successful at building communities of folks who have shared values, but diverse experiences so that they can, learn from one another, work together to achieve a common goal. It's really impressive what we've created with both of these nonprofit organizations and the role that you're playing when it comes to representation in the corporate world after doing that in the public sector. So Fabrice Houdart, thank you so much for joining us today on Chief Influencer. I really appreciate you sharing your stories, your vulnerability about self-doubt that I think so many of us can relate to, but how you were able to really move through that to achieve some big things. And I hope folks who aren't already will check out your Substack, because that weekly noon Wednesday email that you send is chock full of great information about what's happening in LGBTQ plus issues around the globe, with your own opinions put in there too, which we appreciate. And it just, I think, shows one specific tactic that someone can use when they want to influence others. In your case now, 20,000 plus people and counting.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it, and thank you for plugging in the Substack. And it was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Chief Influencer, a production of Social Driver and the Communications Board. If you know a leader who should be featured as a Chief Influencer, please nominate them at chiefinfluencer.org. For show notes and more, visit us at chiefinfluencer.org or follow Chief Influencer on LinkedIn. Until next time.